lesson idea as before, which was the apartheid and desegregation. I like this lesson because it's so long that it can be broken up into different segments. And one segment that I would like to pull out is a project-based assignment where students can go a little bit deeper into this program or this project, I apologize, where they can really start asking some questions about both movements so they can start seeing some similarities and some differences. I would, one of the activities for this lesson will have the students actually layering a map like we learned in the last session. So what we would do is we would all get on Chromebooks and I would proceed to teach them how to layer their maps and build a map. And their theme for their maps, of course, will be events of the civil rights movement and events of apartheid. And what they would do is come up with their own symbols and they would put, and I'll put them in groups so this wouldn't be an arduous task, but putting them in groups of no more than 4 people, and they will start building their 2 maps so they can see them side by side. And what this does, not only does it integrate technology, but it also gives them a really good visual because we normally use atlases, world atlases for them to see things, but it makes it more real when we're looking at more than just a physical map or a political map. We're now looking at an events map, a timeline map, so we can see where things happen and when they happen. And we can also see Africa in relation to North America, specifically the United States or the American South, to see, you know, if culture or location might have an impact on certain movements and, you know, just so they can start asking those questions, some overarching questions. So after we do that as our base, just kind of so they can see it while it's there, our next activity will be to move forward and then start answering some of these questions about each movement. And the idea is the more we ask questions and we answer them, we'll start seeing all these similarities between the 2 movements and even see that one movement inspired the other. And because I want them to be able to connect that these movements aren't just something that happened in the United States, something that just happened in South Africa, that we can trace, we can show paralleling movements around the world and throughout many different time periods. So anyway, what they will do after they do their map project, which, like I said, they'll probably be in groups of 4, so probably about 8 groups, 6 or 7 groups, and they'll build their maps. They'll present their maps to the class because that also shows a level of learning that they have, of comprehension, that they understand what they've done. And using images from the Library of Congress, we will put those images on their maps so they have visuals that they have come up with. They will also embed video clips on their maps as well, and this will be their base. And all of this building up to their project. And the project that I have designed for them is creating a postcard representing one of the movements, and you, or 2 they can choose. So you can do the postcard where if you choose to be from South Africa, then you're going to write your postcard to someone in the American South describing apartheid and talking about how it is similar to what they are going through or went through and during the civil rights movement, asking for tactics and ideals that helped you. If you are writing your postcard from the perspective of civil rights movement, you'll be writing to the apartheid team about suggestions on this is what we did for the movement, this is how we can help, these are things that we saw that were successful. It's like a collaboration of ideas that actually happened, but tying them together to see similarities, as if they would, because they did not happen at the same time. Apartheid, while it was going on, the time frames do lapse a little bit. Apartheid really started getting notoriety, if that's the word I can use, or noticed in the 80s, 70s and 80s. Of course, by then, we were full-fledged into integration, and we weren't really by the 80s, while there was still, maybe some separation, by the 80s, we were fully integrated, a fully integrated society. So anyway, that's option one of the project. Option two of the project is to construct a conversation between Nelson Mandela and Martin Luther King. And in this conversation, using actual writings from the movement, from both men during the movement, construct a conversation of these two men. What would Martin and Nelson have said to one another if they had met at a time during apartheid and desegregation or the civil rights movement? What would that conversation have looked like? And so the students will construct a conversation, but using, like I said, using actual words. And again, we'll use the Library of Congress for that primary source of recordings from either men for speeches, and that's where we'll use that primarily for our resources. So anyway, basically, this is a project. The first, I would say that this lesson is going to take 3 class periods because we want to organize students into groups. The first class period, we're going to put them into their groups where they make their maps. And we want to give them the entire class period to do their maps so that it's thorough, it's not rushed, and it's very detailed. The second class period is when they will initially decide whether they're going to do the postcard project or they're going to do the dialogue project. They can choose one or the other, only those 2 options. And so once they've made their decision on that second day of the lesson, they will begin to work, and we will research, partnering with the media specialists in the library, using sources from the Library of Congress and for their visuals or for their transcript. And we will start that day, and then the following, the third class period, we will finalize and present. So that is the lesson idea I've come up with for an addendum to what I've already done, because this is a large lesson that covers so much. And they would have already learned about the differences. So this is that C3 where they now are solving the problem or taking it to that extra step where they're doing more than just learning about it. They're now implementing what they've learned. So they've asked a question, they've come up with a solution for the question or for the problem, and now they're coming up with ways that they can make it better or something they could do in the future, which is a hard piece, but I think that if they are able to use their conversation or their postcard while they're describing, they'll be able to come up with ideas on how this movement impacts us even today and what we can do today to avoid us returning or reverting back to a system of segregation or racial divide. That's the ultimate goal of this project, is for them to see that there are so many parallels in history. And if we're not careful to learn from history, that we will repeat history. And so I want them to, after studying this and creating their projects, looking at, America today and looking at Africa, and even though there's an ocean separating, they seem worlds apart, how conflict can be so similar no matter where you are, and how looking at those 2 movements can influence and impact our thought processes for today. And their final product that they'll be turning in, like I said, will be their postcards and, of course, or their dialogue sheets.
Yep, that was it.
That's it. Okay, so I guess we need to be very innovative in terms of giving her feedback, right? So what about I'm gonna share the video that we're the video recording we're doing right now with her. So, and she was giving her presentation about 10 minutes. So what about we pretending she's here, we give her feedback about 10 to 15 minutes after we listen to her presentation. And also she sent us the presentation, PowerPoint presentation, and it is on the Google Drive that we shared as well. So if you would like to take a look at it, you can take a look at it as well. was similar to what she shared in the first place, but has been revised. Do we want to take a look at it and perhaps get organized in terms of our thoughts?
Every time I shut my lid, I get disconnected, so I need to reconnect.
Or how about I can share it? Do you, Ben?
Oh, I was gonna, well, I can, hold on. I was just gonna say, I really like the addition of the mapping portion, which I think is new for this iteration, the revised version. I like the idea of using the map to share resources, but also kind of get an idea of physical space, and then she talked a little bit about how the map would be used also to kind of show how ideas were transmitted from one movement to the other. So I really like the idea of that.
I like that she incorporated things that we had learned in the class to kind of make this a more interactive iteration of the project that she talked about before. So I think the kids will enjoy actually getting to make their own map, not just using a map to gather information. And I think the actual final products are really creative and would require a lot of critical thinking because, you know, in a speech or in a postcard, you don't get to say a lot, so you have to really be careful with what you choose. So I like both of the options for the final products.
I really like the idea of her in the project option for the dialogue, to have to look at their actual words, like what they've written, their speeches, and use that to build their conversations.
Yeah, you'd really have to use some critical thinking skills to figure out, well, would Martin Luther King Jr. really say that? Or am I just putting words in his mouth that he would have never said? So analyzing those speeches and kind of figuring out those patterns, I think is a really good critical thinking skill.
I just love the fact that she didn't feel pressure to cover everything really quickly, that she decided to extend the project, giving students and herself time to really dig as deeply as what the content allowed. Maybe some deeper than others, but she's given herself time and room to focus where focus needs to be instead of just covering content and moving on.
So in the original version, it was just one day, one class.
lesson,
Yeah.
yeah. That was, you know, with our lesson too, we were like, oh gosh, how are we gonna do this in one day? So we like begged and pleaded for more time, so I think giving yourself that space was a really good choice.
I got that comment from other teachers as well. So when they first decided to create a lesson about school desegregation, typically was one lesson. Then they extended because they cannot cover or talk about it in one lesson.
Right.
So you need a unit or more time to really go in depth and talking about the topic.
And I know we are librarians, but I do like how she has pulled a librarian in to make sure that she can focus on what the classroom teacher needs to focus on, and she does need to assess, and she needs to, you know, develop the framework for the project to have kids, you know, and do those mini deadlines and all of those things, so that the librarian can focus on what she can do, and then it's a much more well-rounded, I don't know, holistic kind of situation.
I also appreciate the fact as a librarian that she is the one seeking out the librarian.
Maybe we had something to do with that, we hope so.
So that's nice.
The more I do the project like this, I'm learning how important the school librarians are, what key roles you guys are playing in terms of collaboration and putting resources for the content teachers. So you guys are really playing a key role in the building.
That's the idea.
Right? In theory, right?
Right, in theory, exactly.
Right.
And in some, you
I was
said
gonna
with
say-
some teachers, it's better
In
than
practice,
others.
yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Seriously. I had literally had a math teacher go, what does he teach? would you help me alphabetize graduates as they're walking across the stage, Mr. Elliott? I'm like, sure, alphabetizing, that's what I do, sure, that sounds great. You know, and I'm just trying to make light of it. He's like, well, I know you don't teach students and everything, but I think, you know, if you have the list and everything, you'll be okay. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna let that go. You know, I'm just gonna let that go. Maybe I don't know seniors as well as I know my 9th and 11th graders, however, you know, I didn't try to correct him, but the
struggle is
mindset is
real.
still there. The mindset is still there.
What about the assessment? We haven't really touched assessment in this program. Do you guys have any comments for her in terms of assessment?
I have a ton of, this came full circle. I'm working on my last component for National Board Certification, and I initially intended on it being on the Reconstruction era with the same AP classroom teacher, but it just didn't work. I wasn't feeling it, it just wasn't flowing, and so this is where it all kind of came full circle. Without it being the intention, it kind of did. And so I've had to develop assessments as part of that process that I've applied to this process. And so it has really helped, I think, as far as what our learning product was, what kids thought of it. It might have sounded stellar in my head, but what did kids get out of it? That's what's really important. And so I have some assessments as far as their collaboration with their team, because ours was much more a teamwork, had an element of that. It also was prepping them for their AP essay. And so I have assessments, I had all their essays, so I've been able to see what information they got from our lesson that they actually used in their a mock AP essay prompt. So that was really helpful. Lots of LGBT, lots of that they, I don't think would have known otherwise. And so, anyway, it definitely would help. So as far as assessments go, I think teamwork assessment is going to be crucial. And Buck Institute for Project-Based Learning has a lot of great rubrics and things like that that kids can use to have an idea of what good teamwork and collaboration looks like, and so that they know what they are supposed to be doing. But yeah, so assessing, I think doing assessments all along the way, not so much just at the end.
Yeah, I think getting feedback from your students on what did you like, what did you not like, and of course you have to take it with a grain of salt, because you're gonna get that one kid who says, I hate everything, and I hate you, and I never want to see you again. But that's usually not typical of the rule. So, yeah, I've done kind of Google Forms with what you like, what would you change after most of the lessons that I've done this year, and we've gotten good feedback, and it's helped us kind of change the model of some of our lessons. So I would definitely recommend that she does some sort of Google form or survey of what did you like about this project, what would you change, so she can have it for next year or projects in the future.
Formative and summative assessment, right?
And not just of the content, but how did we
Process.
deliver the content, what was the process like for you?
What about the map activity and postcard activity? That sounds really great and could be used as assessment. So do you guys have any feedback in terms of using those two activities as assessment?
I would definitely have a rubric for how you're gonna grade both of those before students start. I think if students have a clear idea of how they're going to be graded before they turn in a product, they're usually more successful. Like, okay, what do I have to do to get these 5 points? Okay, that's what I need to do. They're usually more successful. So make a rubric. It could be electronic, it could be paper, but just having guidelines for your expectations on both of those parts of the project, I think would make students more successful.
Postcard seems like a really narrow, it doesn't have a lot of room for error.
I agree. Except
So-
though that's the summative end product, I don't think it's a summative grade,
Right.
in my opinion. That
Okay.
would not be the,
Yeah,
that would not be, because of exactly that reason. It's
It's
too
too-
little,
yeah.
it's too condensed to show critical thinking and content knowledge, in my opinion. So I think the map itself could be the summative grade, because you have to have a certain number of layers, and you have to have a certain number of sources, and those sources have to be from certain places, and that would be a much easier
Well, maybe
summative
you
grade.
could combine them in the rubric, like your map is a big chunk of points, and either your postcard or the speech is a chunk of points. But I don't know, I think you could probably probably give a little leeway on what is a postcard length,
Right,
you
yeah,
know, or change it to a letter instead of just a postcard if you were looking for more content. But I think it's more difficult to say less and make it important than it is to be able to ramble on and you get all this space, but you're really not saying what's the key point here. Because the point of the postcard is to say, here's what you should try, or how can you help me? And I think that could be summarized
I think if
in,
you,
in a postcard length.
you could, definitely, I'm just saying, not adding any more to her. You know, if she wants to keep it at postcards, because that's pretty simple and very concise and easy for kids to do, but as far as just, if you have exactly what she has right now, what do you use for summative informative? So I think the map would be easier to use for summative, that's all.
I would also be, if they're working together in groups to make the map, I would also be curious to know like how they work together, like
Group
it's,
work is
Yeah,
teamwork.
teamwork. Yep.
yeah, like
I
how they're
worked with-
deciding what to put on those maps,
Mhm.
how that negotiation or negotiations are working.
I worked with a teacher on doing some food blogs for Spanish class. And so they got both a group and an individual grade, and that was probably the most positive feedback we got on the project. That they really liked that they got a group grade, but they also were really excited that they got a grade on their individual portion of the project. So you could give them a grade, or each like person had to do a layer of the map.
Right.
And you could give them an individual summative grade on that, but you could also give them a group grade for the overall presentation of the map and organization and how they work together as a team. So I think students really like it when their entire grade is not dependent on the group.
And there were those kids, when we were working on the social justice project, and when they realized that every single kid had an individual product, you could see the slackers. And then the kids who always get screwed, finally, kind of thing. So I totally agree. There should be an element of both.
In terms of the group grade, what are some of the evidence you see when you give team grade? Because the final product is going to be the final product, group project, right? And when you really give them assess what they do as a group, what are some of the evidence you see as a
I think there should be a whole separate rubric just for the teamwork, and kids could grade each other. You know, so Johnny participated the whole time, didn't fall asleep, you know, those kinds of things. It could be as easy as that. But if you have a whole separate rubric, and then the final score, like each one is worth 4 points or whatever, and you have a score, then that could equate to a number grade or something like that.
I can also see in middle school, is she middle school? or
This
high
is
school?
ninth grade.
Ninth grade,
Yeah.
okay. I can see there being some pushback from students on grading each other, so I think there would also have to be, well, the teacher has the final say, because, you know, if Johnny's just a jerk and gives everybody a 0, like, there's gotta be some override power.
Johnny's a jerk.
That sounds like a song.
But, the way the teacher I worked with on the Spanish food blogs gave them a group grade, it was on, they had one page where it was, their group had to be all on one page, so that page, and the overall appearance of the final product. And of course, she's gonna be doing the map in class, it's not like they're gonna be doing a lot of it outside of class. So you can also just kind of walk around and see how they're working as a team and give them points that way. I think just physical observation of their teamwork.
Well, she's using Google also, is there a way to track changes, like
Yep.
with a Google document?
A revision history and stuff.
Yeah, just
see
to
who
kind of
is
see who's
doing
participating.
what, yeah.
those can be formative assessment, right, as a group. Any
Johnny
other?
didn't do anything. Johnny didn't do anything. on
Johnny
Zoom.
the jerk.
Johnny the
Right.
jerk. And Johnny the jerk did Jack.
Right.
Hey, that's what I do. I'm a wordsmith.
Any
Saturday.
final feedback about her presentation and her lesson?
No, I really like the revised
Uh-huh.
lesson and final products. I think they're good and promote critical thinking.
Yeah, I love the idea to begin with, but she's really, the changes she's made have very much improved it, I think, so, clarified it a little bit. Sounded good.
Snaps to Shauna.
Great. And thank you so much, Chanda. Did you take it yourself and send it to us?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Great participation. Okay, Ben, are you ready?
I guess so.
Ben starts to get some more chips.
Okay.
Chips and
Coffee? Yes.
Can I go up there?
break?
5-minute break.
Yes.
Can I be at the
Yes,
front,
please.
I guess?
This came off of the tripods.
Which one
Yes.
is recording? You saved it in Google Drive, right?
Yeah.
Do you want me to?
I think I can do it. Yeah, so, did you look at this?
Not yet.
Okay, so, yeah, I feel like I'm dealing with some challenging material,
Okay.
about my workplace.
Uh-huh.
I don't know how widely this is gonna be shared.
Uh-huh. I don't think we're gonna share this with anyone
Okay.
else.
Anyway, I don't think it's like incendiary, I just.
No, do you want me to take a look
Well,
right now?
I mean, I'll pull it up now.
Quickly? Handouts, right? That's where you have.
Yeah,
Wow.
is it in there?
Yes, it's in there. Can you find it?
Let's see.
Or do you? What about you?
Yeah,
want
I
me-
can,
Did you find it?
no, but I can log in.
May 12 handouts.
Yeah, it wasn't, I didn't see it.
You didn't see it?
Mhm.
Okay, do you mind?
No,
I can. We have this ouch now. No, this is yours, right?
no, that's my comment from earlier. That's from, that's from the
It's
home
from-
stuff I just attached.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Is that it?
Yeah, no, it is. I think.
The picture is great.
Thank you, I have many of them,
Right.
not in this presentation.
I guess I should take some notes this time. I didn't know we were
She said
giving
the picture was great.
Shonda feedback. I should have known that we were going to, but I don't know why I just forgot to take notes.
I have some notes if you want.
Oh, no, we managed, but, you know, yeah, I had more to say.
I don't know who decided on Baker's Crust as the caterer of choice, but kudos and thank you, because I look forward to this so very much.
Great.
Should I start? Or should
Yes.
I wait, you guys wanna feed, shove food in your face for a minute?
That'll keep us from interrupting your presentation.
It's okay.
Okay, do you wanna keep going?
Yeah,
So-
keep going.
So let's,
You get that.
let me go over the rule one more time.
I feel like I should write.
15 minutes, right, you present, 15 minutes, we are gonna give you feedback, and 10 minutes, we're gonna have the conversation, and 5 minutes, we're gonna debrief our conversation.
Alright.
All right, great?
You'll probably have to remind me.
I will give you a sign.
So, and then I don't know if this will take 15 minutes. So this is my lesson plan for, called Brown versus Board, Massive Resistance, and Collegiate School, which is the school we work at. This lesson is designed to be added to existing instruction, history instruction related to Brown versus Board, Massive Resistance, and school desegregation. I feel like with teacher support, it could be expanded into a capstone course, a semester-long capstone, as part of a semester-long capstone course, like the River City, which is a course that was just completed, and or the hidden history of Richmond, or the hidden history of the River City, which is next semester's kind of digital history course. It has several components. It's designed to continue the discussion of Brown versus Board, mass resistance, and the fight for school desegregation. and also introduce new and relevant primary source documents. It asks students to use these primary sources to generate questions and lines of inquiry for further study. It allows students to perform archival research using online resources in the school's archive, and it asks students to draw conclusions from their research and put it to work by adding historical information and documents to a timeline that will be shared with others. And it's a night lab timeline. So as an independent school, we don't have a lot of guidelines, so I went digging for some guidelines. It's like hunger for structure, I guess. So we are an AP school, so I feel like this lesson fulfills theme and concept guidelines in the most recent history, skill, and content for learning and assessment from the AP people. Themes 1, American and national identity. Themes 2, politics and power. And 4, culture and society. And key concept 8.2, civil rights, government, and responses. I'm very proud of this. The capstone program at Collegiate, which is for seniors, also has objectives and outcomes, including, so capstones are supposed to bring to life students' classroom learning in a real-world context, and are guided by the school's commitment to responsible citizenship, which empowers engaged and contributing citizens by nurturing students' compassion, creativity, and purpose. I think that exploring the subject of Brown in relation to our institution, or school desegregation responses in relation to our institution, fits that description, mission statement. I think it also can promote responsible citizenship, certainly collaborative learning, leadership development, and design thinking, skill building, experiential learning, and public sharing. So we also have 2 documents, Portrait of a Teacher and Portrait of a Graduate, which are not unusual for institutions like ours, where and the characteristics and values it describes, student-centered learning opportunities that help students become inquisitive thinkers, responsible citizens, and compassionate leaders, and it aligns with values and goals outlined in our school's responsible citizenship guidelines. So, speaking of more goals. So, number 1, collaborate with the history department in the creation and transmission of curriculum. That's a big one. Changing hearts and minds about the library. It's an uphill battle. To add context to the discussion of school desegregation with primary source documents. Somebody else in our group discussion mentioned personalization of material, and so the idea here is to personalize this discussion about desegregation and responses by using, the school, our institution, and thinking critically about that history and what it might mean, what it could mean. Put the school's archival collections to work, supplementing those kind of, I guess, more notable documents with something a little bit focused and smaller scale, but I think documents that certainly have something to say about, school desegregation enrichment, so locally. Facilitate student-led archival research in our school's archive, and then collaborate on a digital project that we share. So the format is probably not realistic, but the idea is that it would take place over 2 65-minute block periods, and then also have time in between those classes for students to come to the archive and do some research. In class 1, students will be introduced to the timeline, which I will show you in just a moment, that features important events. It's kind of a bare bones timeline. Important events, a couple of key documents, and collegiate history until 1970, probably. Just small things, not just big landmark things. They'll be asked to read the documents in embed in the timeline and generate questions and potential lines of inquiry from what they read. They'll discuss their findings in small groups and come up with questions to share with the class. Class 1 will also feature kind of a brief introduction to the archive and the materials that we'll be looking at. And then instructions on how to access the material in the collection. They'll schedule time. They'll visit in groups, collect material. It'll be scanned and digitized. And then eventually be added to the timeline. And in class 2, class meeting 2, they'll share the materials and discuss their thoughts and potential solutions. So the timeline, this is the timeline that I made. It's using, using some of the documents that we have and then also some other key resources. So it just kind of moves through the history of the school. Get into the 50s, and then we have the judgment for Brown versus Board 1, Brown 2, the Southern Manifesto, and then so this is the basic timeline that they'll be introduced to and eventually be asked to add more material to as it relates to, I guess, the broader fight for desegregation, and then also how it did, or how that fight did or did not manifest in collegiate history. Does that make sense? I don't know, you're not allowed to tell me. So access, the archives visit will be with me because I guess I took care of the archive. The materials they'll be able to access will be limited because of time and scope, just to that period. We have yearbooks, school newspapers, a lot of newspaper clippings and publicity files, and then photographs. I also have a file of already digitized newspaper clippings from the period that I'll show as well. Gosh, I don't know. Additional thoughts. Students will likely need to consider the notion of absence or silence in the archives. What does it tell us when things aren't mentioned in the material in the period? And then, though I'm sure I'm not achieved it here, and I'm sure it probably already exists elsewhere, I would love to think about how to design a lesson like this that could be taken to different schools, private and public, and be used to kind of explore school history in relation to this period. It seems like it was going to take longer, but I think it did. So there it is. Should I wait off the clock?
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I feel like I should also say that, like, this is, I've never really done this before prior to the one Mel and I worked on together. So I don't know. This is my really my kind of first or second time doing something like this. So I have don't know if I hit any marks. So that's what I was looking for, applause and sympathy.
Great job, right? If this is first or second time,
Yeah.
great job. Okay, so ready?
I think so.
Okay, what about we start with the warm feedback and then move on to the cool feedback?
I really liked how you are using collegiate as your like home base, something the students know about, they feel connected to. I feel like when you have that as you're in, if you've got something to grab their attention, oh, this relates to my life, they will probably be more compelled to participate in the project rather than it being some far out there cerebral idea.
To piggyback on that, I think exactly, it's local, it's relevant, but also if I had to waver a guess, I'm guessing that many of the students are second generation collegiate students, and I think that there is so much family family legacy things going on here, that this really is going to, again, be extremely relevant to them. And if they start talking about this kind of stuff at home, the parents are just going to be all in it as well. So you're gonna get a whole family engagement, I think, good or bad, because it's going to, you might get fired. I'm just saying, good or bad, it's going to cause a lot of conversation. So yeah, I think that is definitely something that's going to be engaging, but depending on how people feel about it, it could be dangerous. So.
Yep.
But I think it's local and it's relevant, and I really like that part.
I also liked the idea of students kind of creating their own questions where they want to dive in and learn more. So just thinking about how you're going to guide them to ask those questions. One question I had in that line is, are you wanting students to add events to your timeline or just materials onto the timeline? So I wonder about that and how you'll guide them to ask questions if it's just about the events that are already there, or how we keep it focused if you're trying to add new events to the timeline. I think either would be awesome, so I was just curious about that.
I was thinking, and we don't want to step on, if you want to.
You can go ahead.
Okay. I love, because I know personally 2 college, now graduate students who just since I have become a librarian have entered into the library science field. So I think that you are going to probably really introduce kids to something that if they are prone to appreciating the past and history, this archive stuff is going to be super cool to them and could possibly, just introduce them to something they didn't even know was a thing.
A career path.
Yeah, absolutely, a career path. So I think that's super cool. I think also this is going to be you already mentioned the whole global citizenship and ethical information and all of that. I think also this could be a great way to encourage citation, and you're giving credit to the sources. If these probably could be embedded possibly into the project itself, because so much is just web-based, EasyBib, fill in the blank template. This could really lend itself to a formalized, really cool situation where you are looking at actual photographers or newspaper editors and things like that, versus it just being I hope EasyBib does a pretty good job with this fill in the blank template thing.
And also, since a lot of your materials will come from your own archives, it would be like, we don't want people to steal our stuff. We wouldn't want people to use our stuff from our archives without our permission. So it kind of gives them ownership of, well, maybe I shouldn't go out and do that to other people's
Stuff
stuff.
comes from somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. Let me see, last thing, let's see. Oh, and I really like the whole point of your idea of this could be a template of sorts that other schools could possibly fill in the blank for their history. I think that's a really good idea, because this is a wonderful lesson, but I wouldn't use it. I would mention collegiate because it was probably one of the schools that benefited the most from the whole segregation and private schools opening and things like that. I would probably mention it. Here in Richmond we have, and in Farmville we have, things like that. But I myself probably wouldn't. I love the timeline, but if I could get it relevant and local to me,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I liked the absence of information idea. I've never heard it kind of phrased like that, but I do think that's something, especially in the post-truth era that we're in, the fake news, like, well, what is the article not saying? It's saying a whole bunch of stuff, but what is it not saying? And I don't think that point or that thing about research or reading critically is brought up enough. So I like the way that you phrased.
I totally agree.
I have nothing new to add. Everything that they said really is what I have in my notes. Is it time for questions?
Questions and comments?
Okay.
Yes.
Like, when getting back to the silence of the archives, are there, in the archives or somewhere on campus, like enrollment numbers over the years or board minutes? So, like, does that stuff exist with you, or is that stuff kind of?
Can I answer that?
Yes, what about, we are very naturally switching to cool feedback, I believe, right? The questions and comments, so are you ready?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay,
Let's
great.
keep it moving.
Please.
Is that kind of
Keep
like
going,
cool
yes.
feedback? I don't think I have any cool feedback.
the wonder and the questions are considered cool, wouldn't you think?
Is
I
that
think
cool? Is it
so.
just
Yeah.
there?
Or-
Because there might be something that's lacking
I
that we.
consider it
Right,
more
instead
clarifying,
of
but.
saying cool feedback, what about comments and questions?
Okay, yeah, I mean, like, does that exist, I guess, somewhere on campus? And how does this become, I guess, not just conversation for these students and for their parents and other family members who also maybe went to collegiate, but how does it become like a conversation for the entire school? Like, what does communications do with it? Does it run in the Spark?
Yeah.
Like, cause I think it's,
Then you get in censorship, yeah!
like, I think it's a really good, their findings could lead to some really good conversations, that I think need to be had school-wide, not just, and not even just school-wide, but I think maybe city-wide, or,
Or maybe you could look at all the private
Yeah.
schools in the surrounding Richmond area and collaborate with them, and what were your findings? What are you finding about all of the private schools here in Virginia? And maybe even put that as a call to action. What do we do now?
and I think it also, I know within collegiate, there's this small group of people kind of like exploring like the future of school, future of education. And I think even for professional development this summer, like there are conversations, like there are like actual like sit down and talk about X topic, Y topic. And I think part of these conversations are like, how does collegiate, I don't know how to phrase this, like how, going forward, when you're in the community, how do you get in the community without taking stuff over? Does that make sense? Like, how do you work as an actual partner with the community without like overrunning stuff? Which,
A true collaboration
yeah,
instead of a
yes,
one-sided collaboration.
exactly. Which I think kind of ties in, which I think potentially ties into the conversations that come out of this. I don't think that made any sense, but.
I think that the more conversation that happens and the more that you look at maybe other schools that have maybe a similar or what someone who doesn't know exactly everything they need to know thinks has a similar history as to the other Fuqua schools or whatever that opened up in the time period, you could definitely start analyzing some trends and having kids, when the conversations happen, that's when you can start running parallels and analyzing things that are, they could consider a trend. I think that the connection, I think it's back to the connection to academic libraries and research. I think that if there are maybe, I mean, this is a collegiate school, but you know, there's gotta be a way that you could connect with the VCU digital libraries, or to have those experts come in and say, this is archival here, but what about archival even on a larger scale? I think that could be definitely a great partnership that you might have with the local community. I was also just curious and wonder about the product. What student product there is going to be? Is it going to be addition to the timeline you've already created? Because your timeline's pretty stellar and really cool. So
Yeah.
how do you duplicate, how do you avoid duplication? How do you insert new ideas and yet it still maintains a continuity kind of flow? Probably need to consider some rubrics, how kids can contribute and how they can be assessed on those contributions, some kind of framework of sorts. And
Group
I
grade
love,
versus individual grade.
and I love Dr. Bryan's comments today on education today. So if you're gonna do a timeline, it seems like that timeline could extend to 2018 and not end at integration. You know, just like he said, I mean, I was very unfamiliar with many of the things that he mentioned today as far as current issues and how the federal government has not been involved. I didn't know any of that. And like literally celebrate, yay, we're all integrated and happily ever after. But that's not the case at all. So I think the timeline lends itself perfectly to current conversations.
Can I make one comment?
I'm done.
In terms of the timeline, so one of the things I was wondering about where students start their timeline and where they end it. There So when we have students create a timeline, perhaps first the thing to really explain to them is how we create timeline, because timeline is created by selecting significant event from someone's perspective. So it's very elementary, but when I ask my students to create a timeline, I ask them to create their personal timeline and ask why did you choose such and such event, and they will say, yeah, that's important. And everybody, when they create timeline, they choose certain events for certain reasons. So I think it might be very helpful for students. So why certain event? What kind of event do you want to include in this timeline, and why are they important? Have them explain, and perhaps that's related to the rubric as well. Giving them just an assignment that create a timeline might not enough. Ask them why they choose a certain event, and that should be a good historical argument, right? And that will be, for me, that's going to be important when you give timeline as a product of this project. So hopefully it makes sense.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
when you're having students creating their own questions or thinking about which events they would add to the timeline, that's where you could kind of bring in that element of, and why did you pick it?
Right.
May I respond?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so,
Not yet.
no.
You guys, not yet. So did you guys
I
have
can't
additional
like
comments?
build these things up. You know?
Right.
I think the voice and choice, having kids create timelines, I think this is an incredible model, but maybe there's another format kids could choose.
Right.
So they could use a Google site, they
Yeah.
could use paper, they could use just images, they
Mhm.
could use, I don't know, like an annotated bibliography, but an annotated timeline, you know, photographic timeline or something.
may I-
Other formats, that's
may I
not all.
respond?
Not yet.
That's not
Any other
exhaustive.
comments?
I think I have
Hey,
said
anything
everything on my
else?
paper.
I mean, yeah, but still, my mind doesn't work quite that way.
I've said everything on my paper.
I'm good.
Yeah, I really like the way that it's using these primary sources, and they really have to make sense out of that. Like, it's not just reading an article and then citing that article and I've got my source, but you really need to, or they really need to, I guess, determine the context, which I think is important. I think they do that, but I don't think they really do it. Good job, Ben.
Maybe then.
One question from me. I wondered what happened before in terms of the capstone course called the River City and Hidden History of the River City. This is just out of curiosity. I wonder if there has been any family engagement in terms of this capstone course before, and what were parents'
Well, so,
responses to that course.
May
So
I-
that was the question. Yeah, and that's it.
Alright.
You can
Now you
respond.
can
So-
talk, yay.
my impression with the River City course, which just ended, and the final project for that was a short film dealing with a different section of the James River and the history of that section. And I was actually very surprised at how I was surprised that they discussed subjects like slavery and redlining and the social and economic impact and legacy of those topics on the city of Richmond, which is kind of what inspired this idea, was that maybe the community is ready to start dealing with challenging subjects a little bit more. Parental involvement, I think there was parental support. I don't know that would exist here. I think it would be stirring up a hornet's nest, and maybe there's a way to thread the needle in that. I love the idea of having students pick their own timeline and then having to explain what and why. I think the reason I selected the timeline project is that's because I feel like it's an easy visual way to draw connections between people, places, and events, maybe, in terms of like a big, but it's also a very traditional and kind of simplistic way to do that. I recognize that. For me personally, that's a way that I can contextualize different events or series of events. I like the idea of other formats. I feel like that's something that would be received positively. stories. I think that would be, it's a good idea, and I think would be well received. Yeah, I would love to take this all the way to the present day. I don't know, I mean, that would be a course, that would be an entire semester to talk about, you know, race, class, you know, and education enrichment. That would be an awesome class.
Maybe you should pitch that.
I'll pitch it.
You should teach it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that would be useful too, because I think that there are a lot of, that's a conversation that needs to be had, and it's being had in some ways, though I'm not sure how deeply people are looking or thinking sometimes. Part of this was like thinking about the values that we transmit publicly versus the values that sometimes I feel are not transmitted. You know, the disconnect between what we say and what we do as an institution, I guess. And I thought this might be a way to kind of examine that a little closely. I think the idea of using it as a professional development or like as a one-day workshop thing for teachers and faculty and staff might be a use for it that I hadn't considered. I really want to introduce the archive as a resource. It's a mess, but I think it still has a lot of value, potential value for stuff like this, and also just, you know, for other 20th century themed classes and interpretive classes. So part of this was to kind of elevate the status of that, to get people not think of it as a storage closet. Yeah, I think I would want students to add events, and so maybe there needs to be some like a splitting, and so that there's, I guess I thought maybe that they would come in with some information from their class discussion of this period and these issues, and so that they would maybe have a few things at hand that they would want to add, like the Green versus New Kent that we looked at today, or other kind of key moments in the school's recreation district. But maybe that needs to be separated off, and so maybe one group of people looks at that kind of stuff, and then another group of people looks at collegiate stuff or the archive stuff that we have. But yeah, I would want them to add events and also add material from our archive or from other digital archives, the Library of Congress or the National Archive. I had some links at the end for some work. Yeah, so a couple of extra resources. National Archive had some really good stuff. This Brown versus Ford exhibit has some really good stuff. So, yeah, what else? What did I miss? Yeah, I really would love to make it so it is repeatable. Almost like a, you could just start from like an information worksheet that you could fill out stuff about your institution, you know. Think about like why it is where it is, how it got there, who used it over time, you know, and how populations have changed. So, anyway, any more questions? Can I ask any more questions?
Do you have questions?
I don't know.
When do we get to the discussion?
Is that
line up with the events that are happening in collegiate history, and then try to make a connection of why you think. So it would be like two overlapping timelines. It would be like a collegiate history timeline, and then a desegregation event timeline,
What
and
about
then
family timeline?
and then your own personal family history with
Okay.
collegiate, and
Yeah.
see how those overlap and make the connections of, well, these two things happened around the same time. Why do you think that? Do they have any sort of connection? So maybe, yeah, on your timeline, just either keep it the way it is and have them do the desegregation part of the timeline, or if you wanted them to really explore your archives, just give them the bare bones of
Yeah.
the events and things you want them to explore. And you could even have them choose, like, oh, that one would be my first choice of what I would want to look up, or that one would be my second choice of what I want to look up.
So are you thinking maybe a timeline with blank squares, but this square needs to address
Brown versus Board.
Brown
of
versus Board,
Education.
and this
Yeah.
square needs, and then they pull from Collegiate's archive in order, and the image that makes sense to them that represents that concept.
Yeah.
That kind of thing. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just kind of give
These
them
are
the-
seniors too, so you
Yeah.
can ask a whole lot out of them,
I don't,
I think.
give them less.
I don't know that, I love the idea of opening up the timeline, having, you know, school history and personal, and then mapping those together. That sounds like a much longer project.
Well, we wanna make more work for you.
No, it's fine.
And justification for getting your archive in a state that you are happy with and get money for.
So yeah, like you could still have,
I guess they would be coming in with, the assumption is that they would be coming in with kind of a working knowledge of this period, and so maybe the historical timeline would be relatively easy, I guess, at least a basic frame, basically would be easy.
but like if you just, I'm looking at your timeline, if you just had the date and opening up collegiate school for girls in the city of Richmond, and then you didn't have any of this extra information
Right.
or the picture, they could fill in that.
Yeah, that's, yeah.
And then the same thing, you could just say 1954 Brown versus Board of Education, or whatever other
Yeah,
events
okay,
that you'd
okay.
like them to look into.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep.
and just don't give them the picture.
Yeah, that's good.
And then see how they overlap.
Yeah, I see how that can work.
I thought you guys might be really interested in being in Alex's presentation when we do the Bernard walk. He is teaching similar context as yours, all girls boarding school, and he was doing this whole unit about school desegregation when I was visiting his class, and he shared these photos from alumni gathering, and my hunch is that he's gonna share one of the photos from the alumni gathering, and I think it was 1970s when the first 5 African American women entered the school, and they invited 2 of them and have them talk about it. So what he was doing is sharing that video clip from that gathering with the students, so the students know that they're alumni, and also there is a magazine where people celebrated the diversity. So the girls from Foxcroft High School, how they feel about integration in 1970s. It was very late, but it was very interesting to see how the girls that someone who used to be in their place really talk about the integration at the time. So I was.
Yeah, I saw him mention that he had worked with their archive,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been meaning to ask him about that relationship with the material, so I think she could do that. Yeah, I think that timeline for black students at independent private schools is not,
Right. What about the collegial? When was the first time African American students?
I think 72.
72?
the history of like education for girls in the early 1900s. Like I don't really have a,
I mean, that's gotta be part of the
A
progressive
sense-
era too, the 1915 it opens, so you're talking about women's rights and the progressive era also, so that's a cool connection.
I guess I don't have a sense, is if like these, I don't have a sense, I guess, if students really understand what was, like, why that would be significant, or why it would be,
Yeah,
I don't know.
I mean, the research that I've done tells me it wasn't that unusual necessarily for women of a certain class. The school started as a college preparatory school. I feel like that was something maybe that new was happening. But yeah, in Richmond I don't think it was that unusual. It's not as unusual as I thought it was.
For
But-
girls to be.
Yeah,
against-
but I think questions about why it wouldn't have been unusual here, or what it looked like in other parts of the city are certainly interesting.
I think so, because one of the things I found was when I was there, students were reading primary source documents, it was a homework. And some schools, teachers worry about homework, right? But in the schools that you guys are teaching, I don't think you have to worry about homework. But I was impressed at how these girls were talking about primary source documents, recognizing the voices from the document and ask very good questions to really to engage the discussion. But one of the things that I found was and they know how to read the primary source documents. They are good readers, and they ask good questions about the primary source documents. But at the same time, I really love, I'm speaking aloud, just thinking aloud. I really like that Alex was sharing those video clips and celebrating diversity when the first African American woman got entered in the school, but at the same time, is it the picture that you see in other parts of the world? Because in the interviews, the two African American women, what they shared was they didn't really have a harsh discrimination or cultural clash when they first entered the school. Everybody was very nice. The only thing they experienced was cultural clash. One woman said she went to school in Washington, D.C. when she was in elementary school, and then she entered this old girls boarding school. And she was surprised by how herself and her classmates were raised in different environments, how they were raised in different manners. But at the same time, everybody was very nice, and she had a very good high school life. And I was thinking, and all the newspapers that they read about the perspective of those who went to school before them in 1970s, they were all highlighting or celebrating the diversity they experienced in the school. And I realized in Alabama or some part of Virginia how other people feel about diversity and integration. So the kind of experience they really brought into is different. Am I making first-hand accounts? It's very different. So I felt like these kids, they have good education, they are good readers, know how to ask good questions, but sometimes the kind of life experience they have is just somewhat limiting them to really understand what was going on in the country. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that was my question in his classroom, and what can we do, giving more life experience to these girls who's going to grow up and perhaps be female leaders or make some changes, right? So I wondered about students in your school, in your AP class as well. Those
That's
who
true.
do very well, read well, write well, and perhaps go to very good schools later, right? And
Who remain isolated though.
right, they remain isolated because of the life they have. And the lessons that we have is really powerful to let them know, hey, you're isolated. The rest of the world is different from where you live.
I had an experience when I was teaching our lesson to the C-level kids, and I feel like everyone knows how you're supposed to feel about
Right.
the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
So the reactions are exactly what you expect, because
Right.
everyone knows how you're supposed to feel about desegregation and Brown versus Board and civil rights and Martin Luther King. But then when we got to the new movements, like the women's movement, this boy got the women's rights movement. And he was reading and he's like, but yeah, all these feminists, they're just feminazis and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, so you don't know how you're supposed to feel about the women's rights
Mhm.
movement because it's still happening. And you've been fed,
Who was
feminazi,
that?
feminazi. So it was interesting to me that you didn't get any differing opinions on the civil rights movement, but when you got to the more recent ones, the ones that are still happening, nobody knows how you're supposed to feel about
Mhm.
those. So the reactions you get are very different.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the challenges when we connect past and the present, right? Because the history matters, because in retrospect, we learn what happened, what went wrong, and what went right, and we can tell the coherent story. But things just happen right now, it's confusing. We don't know how to make judgment about it.
And even the population of our school, because we have GSA, Gay Straight Alliance, we have a pretty large LGBTQ community, but the discussion about LGBTQ, there's still debate. Well, I don't know how I feel, like, you do whatever you want, but I'm still not sure.
And even the
So-
AP written responses were
Uh-huh.
a little bit, you could tell some personal bias was being put into the comments, even though they were reporting what they were finding.
Yeah.
Not so much their personal opinion, but they were biased.
And it was mostly students from our African American community, which I found so strange, that those would be the people not
As accepted.
on board with these other movements.
I have
It's
one,
strange to me.
one thing I did want to say, because I'm looking at the collegiate school website, and I loved the idea that you said with the hidden history versus the public history. And I love the fact, here is a timeline. If you want to know all about collegiate, here on the timeline on our front page of our website, it goes from 1963, the first boys graduate from collegiate, and then it jumps 20 years to 1984. And it mentions nothing about women, African Americans. It mentions nothing about, African American graduations,
Yeah.
and nothing about school desegregation, and nothing. So, that would be something, I don't know.
Snapshot.
That's like
What do you notice?
interesting, like the secret history versus the public history, and propaganda, if you want to go that far, to perpetuate that elitist type mentality about collegiate. I don't know. And here I am from Midlothian,
Right.
and we are the elitist of the public
Mhm.
of sector. So don't get me wrong, we get the same thing.
Mhm.
We get the same thing. We were considered the University of Midlothian for a very long time, so we get it too.
Response?
No.
I have two comments here.
Yeah.
So one was, I like the idea of professional development
Yeah.
for the teachers in the school. So perhaps I think if it is, it might be good, some of your teachers in the collegiate might not know the history of school desegregation.
How diverse is your staff?
Not very.
So that's probably part of it too.
We have both men and women.
Diverse in that way, right?
Gender equality, that's good. You're good with?
Right,
That's not fair.
right.
And we're not diverse much on our staff either, so don't get me wrong, we're not passing any kind of judgment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's something I hadn't thought of. That I
Mhm.
think might be a good place to apply something like this.
Because you are working with all the staff members and teachers in the building, so it might be good if you just give 1 hour professional development workshop and letting them know the history of school desegregation, how that impacts the school.
You could also deliver it as not necessarily professional development on school desegregation, because maybe some people wouldn't be into that. But you could give it as professional development on how to use timelines in your class.
And use it.
And your
Oh.
content just happens to be
Sneaky.
school desegregation.
I think, or even using the archives.
Yeah,
like
using the
how can we-
archives and timelines in your classroom, but my content just happens
Look
to
at
be
you, Miss Mazzanti.
Right.
desegregation.
Sneaky.
Alright, we love the trick. We love the trick. I like the idea of template
Yeah.
because you guys are good at creating a structure or template how do research about their own schools. So if you could create a template and they share that template with other schools, I think that
Yeah.
might be very helpful.
Yeah, this has been kind of a long gestating idea that I don't know how the execution was, or, you know, I don't know. I just tried to put it
Right.
into some frame that I could start to work with it. So, the feedback has been really helpful.
Great,
Thank you.
great. All right.
If you
So
could all delete it from your Google Drives as soon as possible, that'd be great.
thank you so much.
I've already made
for
copies,
sharing
sorry,
your-
and I've already distributed them to,
I didn't put my name on it.
All right, anything else do we wanna talk about our conversation? Did it go well, or is there something,
I really like that format. I know it's kind of weird when you're in person, but I do think it helps me listen in person better.
I'm gonna need a
yeah,
lot
cause
more
usually we're
practice.
so busy thinking about what I wanna say that
Mhm.
we're not busy enough listening.
right,
And then if someone keeps interrupting me, I can't even get out a thought, and I can't work through a thought myself. You know, if someone keeps talking to me
right, okay.
or at me.
No, I like it.
Ben, was it helpful? I'm
This,
torturing you, right?
oh, no, yeah, no, it absolutely was helpful. It's, you know, like, at this point, it's a comfortable room, so I feel comfortable failing in here. You know what I mean? And like,
Right.
or even just kind of struggling with ideas. So I find the format very frustrating, but in terms of like having to wait to respond to questions or not
Mhm.
take things as they're coming at me, I'm
Mhm.
like the opposite, I guess. But I think the process is very helpful. I think my frustration would diminish with more experience. I don't think that's, yeah. So yeah, I thought it was very helpful.
I think the connections we've made are really cool too.
Yeah.
We're all high school,
Yeah.
you know, I think, hearing your experience and your kids are kids, you know, that kind of thing, but we all struggle with
Yeah, and
the same
seeing
things.
different examples of lesson plans is also been very useful. You know,
I wish we as teachers in our profession had more time to do things like this. To get together as a group of professionals and talk about what we've been doing and share what you've been doing.
and it certainly illustrates the value, I guess, of the idea of community of practice, I guess.
Mhm.
So, this is designed to do that. So, I feel like it's been successful in that way. And I feel like some of that spilled over into our interactions with faculty at school already about sharing resources or just, you know, sticking our noses in a little bit with people's projects and things. I don't know. Are you talking about the process as a whole, like the entire class, the entire course?
Right.
Who are
No, just the conversation that you
Yeah.
had,
Just-
fine tuning.
Yeah. It's been really useful and helpful. So even though I feel like I've struggled with it a little bit.
Right.
But struggle makes us grow.
Yeah. No.
And I think this has been a growth process for me. So, and I think it's also really, it's a skill to articulate. You know, this is what I'm thinking in my head, but to actually articulate can even narrow your focus or organize your thoughts or organize your practice.
Or
that
when
much
you say
more.
it out loud, you're like, ew.
Gosh, that sounded really bad. I need to
Yeah.
really rethink that, yeah.
Yeah. Or, oh, that's better than I thought.
Or feel validated, you know, sometimes we feel like islands in the library too. And so, you know, to feel validated, you're like, okay, so I feel like I'm not doing what I should be doing, and then to hear other ideas, okay, so we're all in this together. It's nice.
Right. What do you think, Melanie?
I guess everybody goes into whatever it is they're doing with their own ideas, obviously. So when you're presenting and you get to hear from a variety of people, and it's like, oh, I didn't think about that, or I like that suggestion. That's a huge benefit, I think. And even like if I share something with Ben, it's always good to get feedback from people who like aren't in like the same
Outside the
office
bubble.
with you
Yeah.
or with you 5 days a week. So I like that. Like I like that the warm and that cool, the way like it's worded, cool feedback. Like I think that's pretty important. iteration of the library. It would be nice to get warm and cold feedback from one's administrators.
It would be. It would
In
be.
relation to how one's doing,
Right.
rather than no one saying anything at all.
Be careful what you wish for.
I'm glad you guys enjoyed this time because I know that in your busy schedule, sometimes it's very hard to talk about your own practice, and we try to find out space and time for you really talk about your own work. So I'm hoping this time has been helpful when you create your lessons. For me personally, I really enjoyed listening to different cases, and at the same time, I would love to visit your school if you allow me. It was great experience for me to really go and take a look at how you really implement the lessons, and I'm learning how diverse the schools are. So your school might be very different, and Alex's school is different, and I'm going to visit Wendy's school. Is school in Chesapeake, and she needs to find out 5 different ways to teach about school desegregation for all her students. So it's been very good experience for me as someone who is interested in how history is taught in different contexts. So thank you so much for sharing your practice, and I'm glad to hear that you guys enjoyed this.
Yeah, and I think the
space and time.
execution of what we learn and how we communicate that to kids is so very different too.
Yes.
Because they're still kids, and you have to find the way to do the jazz hands and the dog and pony show that they'll still engage and they'll still be interested. Bringing in their personal baggage from home. I mean, it's still human beings we're dealing with, and so I think that is when we're talking about differentiation and the C-level kids or Chesapeake or the 5 different ways. I think that this really helps too with the actual execution of it. Because all in theory, all on paper, it sounds awesome and wonderful,
Right.
but the practice of it can be so different.
Right, we have Brian, right, the first session, and you all had him as a presenter and speaker, right? But how you're going to make sense of his lecture and use it in your class is going to be totally different, I imagine. And that's because of the students you're working with. So I would be very curious to see how your lesson is implemented and how you work with the students. And what learning outcomes you're hoping to happen in your classroom as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel like we got super lucky because we had other library people
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Normally, it's not like that. So
Right.
that was awesome.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, next question. Where's the trash can? that I'm
Straight
supposed
back.
to
Yeah.
bring?
No, if you go past the food on the,
There are
keep
no
going past the food, but on the right hand, I found wet and dry trash.
Did you have a good
Oh.
session?
That's different than the